Hey everybody, I'm going to be doing the Watergate thing here, so bear with me. There's a lot of stuff that goes into the Watergate. I'm going to use my notes. I'm going to make sure I don't miss anything. You're going to need it for this week's lessons and for the final exam, which you'll be getting next week on Tuesday. It'll be due on Friday, but you'll be getting an actual final exam because we were told we had to do that. So just please try to bear with this. I hope you listen to it. I hope you enjoy it. It's an interesting topic. A lot of people know the term Watergate, but they don't know what it is. They just know it is something bad that revolved around Richard Milhous Nixon's presidency. So I'm going to give you kind of the background, and then step by step, piece by piece, what happened over the 2 years or so that this Watergate thing was going on from 72 to 74 in America. So heading into the 1972 presidential election, Nixon had gone to, we already talked about Vietnam. He was bringing troops home, doing things like that. But he had gone to China. He'd opened up China through a program, a policy called Détente, which was sort of an openness with China, cultural exchange, scientific exchange, things like that. This is where their students would come to America and study. We'd go there and study. Opened up the economy. A lot of things are going to be produced in China starting with all this, so it was a big deal for him. And then he also went and met with the leader of Russia, the Soviet Union at the time, Leonid Brezhnev, and they had signed strategic arms limitation treaties and things like that. So heading into 72, he was fairly popular, controversial but popular. Polls showed that it looked like he was probably going to win, but it really did depend on who the challenger was. And one of the people who was being considered to be as a potential challenger was the youngest Kennedy brother, Teddy. Teddy had gotten in a little bit of trouble for something that happened up in Chappaquiddick where a young lady was killed. But he was a senator, and he was potentially going to be running, and he didn't want to lose to another Kennedy. One of the things that he decided to do after the My Lai massacre leak and then the Pentagon Papers leak was he put together a group called the Plumbers, which I previously mentioned. This was a close-knit group of people around him to prevent leaks. They would carry out all sorts of illegal activities for President Nixon. One of the things that we would learn during the Watergate investigation was that they broke into Daniel Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office in California to try to get some dirt on Daniel Ellsberg. Again, Ellsberg being the guy who released the Pentagon Papers. But one of the things that they decided to do, and this was their fourth attempt at it, by the way, was to break into the Watergate complex, which was like hotels, apartments, businesses, all sorts of stuff. It was a new complex of buildings in Washington, D.C., and Foggy Bottom, I think they call the area. And in the Watergate complex was the headquarters for the Democratic National Committee. And they decided they were going to break into this and bug it and try to, take photographs of information to see what the Democrats were planning on doing in the 72 election. It would give Nixon's a great advantage during that election if they did it. So some of the men that are involved in this, H.R. Haldeman is the chief of staff. That's a name you should probably know. John Ehrlichman is the chief domestic advisor. John Mitchell was the former attorney general who would actually head up what is called CREEP, the Committee to Re-elect the President, CREEP. But he was the former lawman, top lawman in the country. And John Dean is the presidential counsel. Those are some names that you should know. But what happens is, on June 17th, 1972, 5 men are going to be arrested breaking into the Watergate complex, and they're going to be arrested in the headquarters of the Democratic National Committee. On them are bugging equipment, little spy cameras. They had like $2,400 in cash. They even had little tear gas pens, all sorts of stuff. It would be figured out that they were employed by CREEP by a couple newspaper journalists, Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein from the Washington Post. That's going to take a little bit of time. But those who were arrested, a few of them were Cubans. who had taken part in the Bay of Pigs invasion. And then you had a couple guys, James McCord and E. Howard Hunt, who were former CIA. So with all that going on, Woodward and Bernstein begin to think that there's more to this than a third-rate burglary, as it was called by Nixon's administration. So Woodward and Bernstein, from the Washington Post, specifically Woodward, he had previously worked for the Navy, and he had ties to some people in government who were, I guess, pretty powerful and important and knew a lot of secrets. He ends up getting a hold of one of these men, and they end up meeting, and it was all hush-hush and secret, and they would meet in a underground garage in D.C. at like 2 in the morning, and there were ways that they would know to meet up with each other, a little flag on Woodward's patio on his stoop, or Woodward would open up his copy of the paper and there would be a time written on it, and that was how they communicated instead of via telephone, because as this man told Bob Woodward, they were bugged, everything was, they were being listened to and everything. So they decided to call this man by the code name of Deep Throat. Deep Throat was the name of a film at the time. It's kind of an embarrassing thing for me to have to say every year, but that's the term they came up with for this person. And the person told them what they should do is that this thing goes all the way to the top, higher than you can ever imagine, and they need to just follow the money. So they started looking into bank accounts and things, and they found a $25,000 check that was earmarked to the Committee to Re-elect the President, CREEP, to the Nixon administration, the campaign, that had gone directly from there into one of the Watergate burglars' bank accounts. Because of this, the FBI was looking into the break-in, and Nixon, in the Oval Office, orders the CIA, one of his people, to tell the CIA to prevent the FBI from investigating the Watergate break-in. The CIA doesn't do that, but this would eventually be found out, and I will get to that. That is a problem. That's obstruction of justice, and you'll see that. Now, in November, with all this going on, Nixon absolutely throttles the Democratic challenger, George McGovern. McGovern, I did look it up, he did only win Massachusetts and the District of Columbia, so it was an absolute butt-kicking by Nixon in this thing. Now, on December 8th, 1972, a plane crashes outside Chicago. On the plane is one of the Watergate burglars who was arrested's wife, E. Howard Hunt's wife. Within her baggage, in her luggage, is $10,000 in cash. It would be found out that she was then transporting, she was sort of the courier to pay hush money to people involved in the Watergate break-in, since they had figured out the bank account transfers, that was too obvious. So she was the courier for the illegal hush money that was being paid. Now, E. Howard Hunt just lost his wife because of this whole thing. He's been arrested. He's going to go to jail probably. He's got kids at home, and he starts demanding money or else he will talk. February of 73, the Senate decides they're going to set up the Select Committee on Presidential Campaign Activities to look into the Watergate break-in. March 1973, James McCord, one of the other Watergate burglars, former CIA, feels he's going to be made a scapegoat, and he decides that he's going to talk to the committee. And while he is being interviewed by the committee, he tells the committee that John Mitchell, the former Attorney General, the man who is heading CREEP, is the overall boss of the break-in. And this sort of starts to blow things out of the water a little bit. April 73, Nixon's starting to feel the pressure. He tells the Attorney General, Kleinheist, H.R. Haldeman, John Ehrlichman, and John Dean, all of his closest inner circle people, that they should probably resign. John Dean is then going to be brought in front of what will be called the Watergate Committee. The special prosecutor's name is Archibald Cox. He invites him to testify, and John Dean shows up and gives something like a 7-hour opening statement, where during the statement he says absolutely that Richard Nixon used the term cover-up with him dealing with the Watergate break-in at least 35 times. And this is all on television, and the American people are seeing this in front of their eyes. Now, July 13th, 1973, on TV, in front of the country, in front of the committee, Nixon's former press secretary named Alexander Butterfield is asked if he knows of any recording devices in the Oval Office. And it's a pretty interesting video clip if you ever want to look it up, Alexander Butterfield. But when he's asked, he turns ashen, and you can see that he knows, he's under oath, he has to answer that yes, Nixon does have recording devices in the White House. He was a very paranoid guy. Between the recording devices, the plumbers, and then he made a list of all of his enemies, for example, all kinds of people on here: Bill Cosby, the actor, Jane Fonda, Joe Namath, the quarterback, Barbara Streisand, hundreds and hundreds of people on his enemies list. Because of this, the special prosecutor, Archibald Cox, demands the tapes. Nixon refuses, orders the system disconnected, and the Watergate Committee will sue to get those tapes. Now, October 10th, 1973, the vice president under Richard Nixon, Spiro Agnew, he resigns as vice president, has nothing at all to do with Watergate. He resigns because he got caught up in tax evasion and bribery scandal from when he was the governor of Maryland. So the new vice president will be the minority leader in the Republican Party from Michigan, Gerald Rudolph Ford. All right, October 20th, 1973. Nixon orders the current sitting Attorney General, Elliot Richardson, to fire the special prosecutor, Archibald Cox. Elliot Richardson refuses to do this and resigns. Nixon finally finds somebody to do it, the Solicitor General named Robert Bork. Bork fires Archibald Cox, the special prosecutor, and it was a Saturday evening, and this is referred to as the Saturday Night Massacre. And for the very first time, because of this, members of the Congress, the House and Senate, start actually using the word impeachment. And if you're President of the United States, you don't ever want members of Congress using the word impeachment as it pertains to you. So the Saturday Night Massacre was a big deal. Nixon, on October 30th, 10 days after the massacre, is ordered to turn the tapes over. He does. A couple tapes are missing. Says they must have been misplaced. And then on November 17th, he goes on television and says his famous line that everybody knows from Nixon is, "The American people need to know if their president's a crook." Well, I'm not a crook. Well, he might have been a crook. He was, I think. November 21st. Investigators listening to the tapes found an 18-and-a-half-minute gap at a very, very pivotal point in a conversation between Nixon and I believe it was Ehrlichman or Haldeman, one of his closest aides, that he blames this 18-and-a-half-minute gap on a mistake made by his secretary, Rosemary Wood. We still to this day have no idea what is in the or on the 18-and-a-half-minute gap. Nobody's been able to figure out how to retrieve that information. I'm sure someday it'll happen. But January 1974, Nixon's ordered to turn over all of the tapes. He again refuses to do this, and it goes to the Supreme Court. In April of 74, Nixon offers the committee, instead of the tapes, 1,200 pages of edited transcripts that he edited himself. The committee, of course, refuses this. July 24th, the Supreme Court of the United States unanimously agrees Nixon has to turn over all of the tapes. 8 hours later, he does. And on the tapes, there is absolutely, without a doubt, a smoking gun that Richard Milhouse Nixon, when he told his aides to order the CIA to stop the FBI from investigating the break-in, he had obstructed justice in order to cover up. He was in trouble. So July 27th, 3 days after he turned over the tapes, the House Judiciary Committee passes 3 articles of impeachment against Mr. Nixon. They are obstruction of justice, abuse of power, and contempt of Congress. Nixon will not be impeached. You need to know that. We've had 3 presidents impeached in history: Andrew Johnson, Bill Clinton, and Donald Trump. Nixon was not impeached before he would get impeached. We're going to go on the Wayback Machine. The 1964 Republican presidential candidate, Barry Goldwater, who was a big deal in the Senate, went up to the White House and told Nixon, for the good of the country, he needed to resign. And August 8th, 1974, Nixon goes on television and announces he will resign the presidency the following day. On August 9th, 1974, Gerald Rudolph Ford will be sworn in as the 38th President of the United States. His vice president will be Nelson Rockefeller. Yes, those Rockefellers, that family. And within a month, September 8th, 1974, Ford decides to grant Nixon a full pardon for all crimes committed while he was President of the United States. Now, this hurts Ford in the short term. People are angry that Ford gave a full pardon. Ford's reasoning for it was he decided it would not be helpful to the country to drag all this on anymore. It would, of course, not be helpful to do that to a former president. And it would hurt Ford's future politically. He would lose, and a lot of people believe that's probably why he would lose his chance for being elected on his own in 1976. He would lose to James Earl Carter, call me Jimmy, from Georgia, the peanut farmer. But it would honestly, when Ford died in the early 2000s, that was considered his greatest legacy, sort of falling on a sword for the country. He took one for the team, so to speak. And little trivia: Ford is the only person who ever served as vice president and president of the United States while never being elected to either office. So the results: dozens of people went to jail for their crimes. Of course, Nixon did not. The media now, Woodward and Bernstein became sort of cult heroes, figures for breaking this whole thing open and bringing a presidency down that, in their opinion, and many people's, probably should have been brought down because of the crimes committed. They would write a book that won, all sorts of awards. It would be turned into a movie. It's called All the President's Men. I usually show it to you, but not this year. If you want to watch it on your own, it's very good. And that was pretty much the legacy. And we would later learn in April of 2005 that Henry Hyde, the guy who ran the Clinton impeachment, had actually said that the Clinton impeachment was revenge for them going after Richard Milhouse Nixon. So it all comes full circle. So I know there's a lot to this. If you want to watch it again before you get your assignment on Watergate, you can do that. Or as you go along, probably a lot of the questions you're going to have to answer are within my little lecture here. It's been a tough year. It's been a great year to a certain respect. I mean, I've really actually enjoyed learning all this new technology and doing a lot of this stuff. So congratulations, your year is done. You will be getting a final next week, but I hope you've enjoyed. Take care. Bye-bye.